Hello, everyone. This is Heretics Corner. Thanks for joining us. I'm Obaid, and with me is Nulli.
Hello.
And Dean is lost somewhere in the outback, apparently. So hopefully he will join us. Today we have a really special guest. I'm excited to be talking to him today. His name is Afzal Upal. He's an ex-Muslim, ex-Ahmadiyya, and he's from Pakistan originally, living in the US now. And Afzal also recently released a book called Moderate Fundamentalists, about cults, and I guess more specifically about the Ahmadiyyas. Hi, Afzal. Thank you for joining us. Really great to have you on.
Hi, Obaid. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to join your broadcast, and thank you.
So would you like to start by telling us a little bit about your background, and then we can take it from there?
Absolutely. So, as you said in your introduction, I grew up as an Ahmadi in Pakistan, and in the Ahmadiyya headquarters in the small city of Rabwa, and lived there, went through school, was very devoted. My father was a missionary for the Ahmadiyya movement. And then, so as I say in my book, I didn't see him. My first time seeing him was when I was 7 years old, because he was a missionary in West Africa. He went there when I was around 3, and he came back when I was around 7. So that's when I saw him for the first time, and he looked different than I imagined him to look in the few black and white photographs that he used to send us. Then the movement sent him to Canada, and that's how my family came to Canada. I did some of my school and university in Pakistan, and then continued in Canada, and then I've lived in Canada and US. And my training is in artificial intelligence, cognitive science, and one of my interests is in cognitive science of religion. So the book that you talked about, Moderate Fundamentalists, I apply cognitive science of religion principles to understanding how the ideas that underlie the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat got started. So I trace the history from its founder, the ideas that he was exposed to, and the ideas that then ended up resulting in what is the central doctrine in the Ahmadiyya movement.
Okay, I have to ask you this because to me it's a little strange. Normally, okay, in the North American context or the European context, when you hear missionary, you think of someone going to small villages in Africa or Asia or something like that, and spreading Christianity basically to these people. But when you said your father was sent as a missionary to Canada, that seems so foreign to me. Like, you just never hear it in that context.
No, I completely get that. And so, yeah, many people ask me that question. And one of the very interesting things about the Ahmadiyya movement is that it started out as I delve into a little bit of 19th century British Indian history. It started out what was perceived by the Muslim elite, especially in northern Indian cities of Delhi and Lucknow, as an onslaught of missionaries unleashed by the British occupation of India. So one of the responses of the counter response by the local Muslim community then manifested itself in the form of Ahmadiyya movement. But one of the neat things about those responses is that in responding to the British, they adopted a lot of the methodology of the British missionary movement. So they established a British a missionary school for Muslims to train Muslim missionaries who would then take the fight back to the homeland. Similar kind of rhetoric that we heard, remember a lot during the Iraq War. Take the war over there to them. So the same kind of idea underlie the Ahmadiyya movement. Take the fight over there to them, to their homelands. So yeah, my father was a missionary. He did do the thing, living in remote villages in West Africa, in Ghana, in the Gambia, in extreme places with extreme poverty, and then going through the whole pioneering experience and building the first mosques and all of that kind of stuff. But they see Canada the same way. They see Canada, Britain, U.S., Germany also as a battleground, as taking the fight to the people who brought the missionaries to us, and we are going to do it the other way. We are going to convert them to what they see, Ahmadiyyat, or as they call it, the true Islam.
How would that differ from like the Tabligis? Because the Tabligis are, the way I've heard the Tabligis being described, they're more like evangelicals, but they're like, okay, we're putting out all these leads with all these lights, and once the lights come on, Allah will take over. Like, was that the same kind of thinking, but not as extreme, or?
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off. But yeah, it
No,
is. The origins of all of these movements are very close, both geographically and temporally as well. So you look at the Deobandi movement, you look at the Ahmadiyya movement, you look at the Tablighi movement. They all started pretty much in northwestern India. They pretty much start around the same time in the 19th century, early 19th century, and early to late, I should say, 19th century. But they all have slight differences in that response. So they all trace back their root to the Muslim reform movement, going back to Shah Waliullah. So they all revere him, and his whole emphasis on trying to remove all the what Shah Waliullah saw as bad influences in Islam, in cleaning up Islam of this excessive practice of piri fakiri, right? Focusing on all these peers and these excessive, what he saw as excessive Sufi practices. Going and praying in front of the tombs of the holy saints and whatnot. Doing taweez, those written amulets, that kind of stuff. So all of them were, sort of following Shah Waliullah in that. And another irony of all of this is that Shah Waliullah started out as a Sufi. He was a formally trained, formally ordained Sufi. So he was trying to clean up Sufism from within in his mind, and he became one of the sort of the modern reformers that all of these people took on as their spiritual, the forefather of their movements. But then their emphasis slightly differ. So the big difference between Ahmadiyya movement and the other movements is that the key thing that the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Shah, was he said that I really want to counter the central argument that the Christians are using in order to convert what he saw as illiterate peasants in northern India who happen to be Muslims. And he said what they're saying to them is that your own book, Quran, and your own Islamic doctrine says that Jesus is more of a holier person, has a higher status than Muhammad. Because your own Islamic tradition says that while Muhammad died and lay buried, Jesus did not die. He went up to heaven and sits on God's right hand. So who do you think is better? Who do you think is higher? And they're using that as a method to infiltrate into Muslim mind, and then to show that really Christianity is superior to Islam. So he said, we need to counter that argument. We can't make any headway until we reform that misconception from Islam. And he said the solution is to insist that Jesus also died, that he was just a human being. And then he went beyond. So much of his writing is very, very nationalistic in terms of us versus them. It's the Muslims are better. The Holy Prophet is the best prophet ever, the best human being ever. and Jesus was far, far inferior to him. And that being the core message, which is very different. That sort of message differentiates the Ahmadiyya movement from all other responses that originated from 19th century India to the missionary movements, the Christian missionary movements.
Okay. Oops, sorry. Just for some background, if someone doesn't know much about Ahmadiyya, the only thing I ever learned growing up was that Ahmadiyya aren't Muslims.
Right.
So I was raised in a very, very extreme Sunni household. So would you be able to explain perhaps what might be the difference between the two and why your mainstream Sunnis would say that Ahmadiyya are not Muslim?
Absolutely. So you get different responses, depends on who you ask. So if you ask Ahmadiyya missionaries, and then I grew up in the Ahmadiyya headquarters in Rabwa, went through, they have their, so Ahmadiyyas are very missionary oriented, just like Tablighi. So that makes them very similar to Tablighis, and I think that's why Obaid asked his question. So that all kids are indoctrinated into how to respond to the questions, and fairly thorough training that you go through, part of your Sunday school, as part of your summer schools. So their response is to focus on this notion. They would say that the basic difference is that Jesus is dead. That's what they want to discuss. That's what they want to emphasize as the basic difference. They think that that is a winning argument from their perspective. If you talk to Sunni Muslims, they would say that the biggest difference is that Ahmadis believe that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is a prophet, a full-fledged prophet, and that puts them outside the mainstream of Islam. And they would say that that is the crucial difference. And of course, both those things happen to be true at the same time, but you get a different answer, depends on who you ask.
Just a question on that. Like in your book, you'd mentioned, how there was pushback to the Ahmadis from their inception, but I think you mentioned somewhere like in the 70s it got even worse. While you were growing up, did you notice that, or was it easier earlier on, or did it progressively get worse, or was it always the same level of pressure all the way through? I mean, like just the other day or a few days ago, you had the mosque that was burned in Pakistan, the Ahmadiyya mosque. I mean, like, were there things like that even back then, or is this more recent now?
So you're right in the sense that Ahmadiyyas faced hostility pretty much right from the start. Actually, it's not exactly from the start, as I point out in my book. Ahmadiyyas, Mirza Ghulam himself, and the company that he kept, much of the company associated with the Ahl Hadith movement early on, at least identified with much of their key doctrine, to the extent that once people insisted on taking Mirza Ghulam Ahmad to a debate with an Ahl Hadith leader, and Mirza Ghulam Ahmad said, "I got nothing to disagree with him. I agree with everything he just said." So those people initially agreed with everything that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad said, until he said that I am a prophet, God. And that's when the Ahl Hadith also split away from him. The other traditional Sunni Muslims, even before, were saying that whatever he's saying, just because he's saying that he receives revelation from God, and God keeps talking about in those revelations about how special Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is and has a special status, that on its own puts him outside the fold of Islam. But once he formally declared himself to be a prophet, then his Ahl Hadith friends also started, and actually they became his biggest enemies. Then they went around India to gather signatures to declare him to be non-Muslim. And of course, that was not an issue at the point in British India, because British were around. It wasn't a Muslim state. But when Pakistan became a state, the first riots happened in 1953. And the government had to declare martial law. the first martial law that got declared in Pakistan in Punjab province was in 1953 to prevent mobs from attacking and killing Muslims and attacking their places of worship and their houses. Then that erupted again in 1974. And so one of the things that you have to know is that I grew up in the headquarters of the movement, which is a city created by Ahmadis from scratch, the city of Rabwa. The city is entirely run by Ahmadis. Pretty much the only people who live there are Ahmadis. So I didn't face as much of it, but it was very much there. I mean, you left the city and you don't tell anybody that you're an Ahmadi. Even this is now back, in the 80s and 90s. Actually, my family left in 1990, so I only know before that. And you wouldn't tell people that you're going on the public transit back. You wouldn't tell people that you're coming to Rabwa. You would tell them, a nearby city or something. Otherwise, they wouldn't, let you onto the bus, or people might, start saying nasty things to you and that kind of stuff. My father, when he was a missionary in Islamabad, he was sued because he had written Ahmadiyya Muslim Mission outside the office where he worked. One of my uncles was sued and had to leave the country because he was pretty high up in a private enterprise. He was their their sales manager. He was an engineer by training, and he prayed at the person's place of employment that he was visiting at prayer time, and he was sued that you prayed like Muslims, and that was made a crime in 1984. To pretend to be a Muslim, I think, are the actual words in the Constitution now. If Ahmadis pretend to be a Muslim, behave anyway like Muslims, they offend the feelings of other Muslims, it says, and that is a crime, punishable offense. So, and as the law and order situation in Pakistan has gone from bad to worse, and economy has gone from bad to worse, I hear that things have gotten even worse, but they were pretty bad. They were pretty bad back then too.
Late last year, there had been a proposal in Pakistan, or was it early this year, to take out the oath of office that you would have to say Muhammad's the last prophet, right?
Yes. Yep.
And then the population started rioting. So it's not like what's going on in Iran right now, or or like the Arab Spring a few years back, where it was a population rising up against the government. In Pakistan, it was the government wanted a very, very slight relaxation of rules, but the population erupted. I mean, does that give you any cause of concern? I mean, it gives me a lot of concern. Like, will the population in Pakistan allow any lessening of the rules, even if the government wanted to?
Sorry, to be honest with you, it was even worse than that. So what had actually happened was that the Supreme Court declared at that time the sitting Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif of Pakistan Muslim League, a party on the center right, to be corrupt, and they said that according to the Constitution, the Prime Minister and even any member of Parliament has to be Sadiq and Amin. And because he had been shown to be corrupt, he was no longer Sadiq and Amin. Therefore, he could not hold the office of Prime Minister. And that then disqualified him from also holding any office within the party, Pakistan Muslim League. So there was an attempt to make some changes to laws to allow him to at least hold the presidentship of the party. So he resigned from the post of Prime Minister, but he still wanted to hold on to the authority within the party so that he could be a kingmaker, if not a king. So he could appoint the next Prime Minister and still continue without much more accountability against him. So as they were making those changes, they say accidentally, in a hurry to get those changes passed quickly, the clerk made the mistake of omitting that one line, which said that the Prime Minister or the President also has to be to believe in the finality of the Prophet Muhammad. And as that change was made, I guess all the Pakistan Muslim League people passed that in a hurry, as happens even in the U.S. Right? They without reading the whole thing. It was too long of a bill. Nobody read it. It went through. As it did, the anti-Ahmadiyya lobby got a hold of it, and they saw that as a plot from behind the scenes, a grand conspiracy by America and all the anti-Pakistani forces, Israel and Jews and Hindus, to weaken Pakistani laws against Ahmadis. And in their world, there is constant pressure on Pakistan by US, Israel, and India to relax rules against Ahmadis, because of course Ahmadis are really favored by and that's their central argument is that they're British agents. Ahmadis were British agents planted by the colonial administration to divide Muslims, and they've continued patronizing them. And that's why the Ahmadiyya central leadership now lives in London, and they try to interfere in Pakistan because Ahmadis are their agents. And it was really those governments that really made this change happen. Now, the government kind of anticipated that, and they said, let's reverse that. So right away, I think within like a day or two, they reversed the change. And they put that language back. But that was not enough. So the mobs then occupied the central highway that leads the capital into the capital from the rest of the country. And they said, we will not leave this highway until the people who are responsible for this change happening, the genuine people, we know you did the stupid theory that you've given us, it was a clerical error by some low bureaucrat. We want somebody held accountable, somebody resigning, then prosecuted for hurting Muslims' feelings. And we want promises that nothing like this will ever happen, that anti-Ahmadiyya things will continue, and that kind of stuff. So they had a whole list of demands along those lines. And the government resisted until the military intervened on behalf of the protesters and prevented the government from executing the court's orders. The court said, the government needs to go and clear the highway. And the military said, no, you can't force the protesters to leave. You can't use force against protesters. We will not allow that. And the military then mediated between government and the protesters. And the agreement that came out essentially pretty much agreed to everything that the protesters had said. And on top of it, this wasn't even demanded by protesters. They were all given a few thousand rupees as a compensation for coming and illegally blocking the road for 3 weeks in Islamabad. So that has actually had nasty consequences. So that movement, which started, against that whole episode, has spread throughout the country. And what used to be the center-right Pakistan Muslim League, which used to be seen back when they won the last elections as kind of, until like Pakistan People's Party, which is on center-left, which is the government that they replaced, and Musharraf, who was even, before People's Party's government. Both of them were seen as, leftist and pro-American, and this was more center-right. At that time, when they came into power, they were favored by people who wanted a dialogue with the Taliban, a dialogue with the extremists rather than confronting them. Now, all of a sudden, just because of this clerical mistake, which I believe it was a clerical mistake. They had no intention to actually, it wouldn't have furthered them in any possible way. There's nothing Muslim League could have gained out of this. Ahmadis don't have any voting power. America wouldn't have done anything for Muslim League either for doing this. I think it was a genuine clerical error. Because of that, now they became enemies, and now they are being attacked everywhere. A minister was shot. The Interior Minister, Federal Interior Minister, was shot for being responsible for being soft on Ahmadis when he hadn't done anything of that sort. So no, it's really bad. I mean, it's just terrible. And this whole army getting involved and resolving the situation in favor of the protesters actually has emboldened them. And it is what resulted in the incident a couple of days ago in Sialkot, which was a mosque about over 100 years old, the mosque where Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, when he visited Sialkot and he lived in Sialkot for a few years, had prayed at and all that stuff. So it was a historical mosque important to Ahmadis historically, so they brought it down. Of course, they don't call it a mosque. It's illegal to call Ahmadiyya a place of worship in Pakistan a mosque. I could go to jail just for saying this here on this podcast.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to talk a little bit more about your book, because like I said, it was really interesting, and there's a lot of information in there. So, like, if you want to just like give a brief synopsis, because I think anyone listening to this should actually read your book because it was very, very interesting. But if you want to like maybe go through a bit of that.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. So, what interests me in general as a scientist and as a cognitive scientist is I want to understand how do ideas get propagated, how do they spread, how do they change as they spread from person to person, and in particular, I'm interested in religious ideas. So, and the reason for all that is going back to the foundations of the discipline that I mentioned, cognitive science of religion, which says that, unlike what many other scholars of religion say, that religion is special, that it involves some special cognitive mechanisms through which it operates. So religious beliefs are special beliefs. Cognitive science of religion says no, they're not. The religious beliefs arise out of ordinary cognition. So our ordinary cognition evolved through evolutionary forces to in the natural evolution processes because of evolutionary advantages as a good fit. So in order to explain religion, we need to see why these ideas were attractive to the human memory, to the human mind, that gave these ideas transmission advantages in terms of spreading from one person to another person, because that's how they spread. And if we understand that, if we can figure out what are the transmission advantages that religious ideas have, then we would understand why religion continues to persist. So my research has been on one particular kind of ideas, which are called minimally counterintuitive. So ideas that counterintuitive in the sense that they violate some category assumptions. So they're counterintuitive. So the idea of a flying chair, for instance. So it's a chair in all other respects, but it flies. Therefore, it's counterintuitive. And they're minimally counterintuitive in that they only violate one or two, a very small number of such categorical assumptions. So my work has shown that that kind of ideas give you, the reason why they spread is because they're more memorable for people. And then I looked at why did evolution design human beings? What are the evolutionary advantages that remembering that kind of ideas could have given people? And I've done some analysis which shows that it's again ordinary cognitive processes which evolved because evolution favors people who are eager learners, who can figure out. So when you encounter a new idea, you have to figure out whether I should devote precious memory resources to that idea or not, and you would devote more resources if that idea gives you some evolutionary advantage. And evolutionary advantage for ideas is that they allow you to predict the world. If you can predict the world, then you can gain advantage over your competitors in terms of better access to resources, in terms of better access to mates, in terms of better access to various things. So they're there to allow you to make a prediction. So if the idea of a flying chair allows you to predict your environment better than the idea of an ordinary chair, so that would be an intuitive idea, or the idea of a chair that's flying and it's radiating and it disappears on Tuesdays and it talks to people. Now, maximally counterintuitive, it's got a whole bunch of counterintuitive assumptions. Then the minimally counterintuitive ideas would be favored because they're more memorable for people, is what my work shows. And the reason why they're more memorable is because they are good learning opportunities. And they're good learning opportunities because they break our prediction machine. We can predict intuitive ideas. If you've seen a bunch of chairs, you can predict another chair. There's no reason to remember another chair. But a flying chair is special because it breaks your predicting machine. The maximally counterintuitive ideas also break your prediction machine, but you can't learn anything from them. It's kind of like teaching nuclear physics to kindergartners. You just can't do that. So the minimally counterintuitive ideas happen to follow that perfectly, and therefore they are most memorable. So that really is the basic basic idea, basic research that I've done in cognitive science of religion. What differentiates my work from other cognitive scientists of religion is that they say that that this particular better memory for minimally counterintuitive ideas should only be limited to certain types of ideas. They say that mechanism of better memory for minimally counterintuitive ideas should not be allowed to explain all sorts of things, and I disagree with them. I think it can be used to explain ideas of new religious movements. It can be used to explain innovations in culture. It can be used to explain all sorts of things. And then I wrote the book in order to show that these radical claims that founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, was making in British India, which were seen as radical even by his contemporaries, how they were minimally counterintuitive. They were counterintuitive, yet they could make some sense. You could still justify them, and therefore they weren't maximally counterintuitive. So that essentially is the core theme of the book. One of the side themes is that that Ahmadiyyas, there's this perception, the image that that Ahmadiyyas have, in particularly in the West, especially in Canada, is that they're moderates. And in the West, when people talk about Muslims, they talk about those two extremes. It's you're either a moderate or you are an extremist. You're a fundamentalist. And I wanted to say that kind of binary scheme is wrong. You're not just a moderate and you're not just a fundamentalist. And I said nobody really inhabits those two, or very few people really inhabit those two extremes. Majority of people happen to lie somewhere in between, and in between in that continuum. And I say that's where Ahmadis happen to fit in as well. They're moderates in some respects, and they're fundamentalists in other respects. So I say moderate fundamentalist is a better term to describe Ahmadis and many other Muslims, actually. It's hard to find pretty much anybody who would be considered a moderate from a Western perspective, right? A Muslim who believes in freedom of religion for minorities, in people's right to be free from religion, and in equal rights for minorities and for women. And that kind of thing just doesn't exist in any sizable or significant numbers in the Muslim community. So that's the second theme. That's where the title of the book comes from.
Just going back to that, I don't know if you've heard Brett Weinstein talk about, like the evolutionary biologist. He talked about metaphorical truth when he was talking about religion. What he was saying was, even though you know this isn't true, but from an evolutionary standpoint, and I'm probably messing this up hugely, but from an evolutionary standpoint, if you act how it would be for you to get to heaven, that will make, and if that makes society flourish, those ideas will stick. And he was saying, like in that sense, you can see why we have religion and why it's evolved. I mean, I have some issues with that, because if you're a Muslim and you act like you want to get to heaven, then, kill the infidel, kill the non-true Muslims, that doesn't seem like flourishing of society to me. I don't know if you've heard him talk about that, or if you've looked into that, or if that kind of fits in with what you're saying, or is that, like, are they completely different?
I haven't heard before of that particular model, but I have heard of a number of similar theories which explain religion in a whole bunch of different ways. They give us the benefits that you get from social cohesion. They give us benefits that you get from order that it creates in societies. They give us benefits that this kind of stuff creates by creating hierarchies in a society, by allowing those hierarchies to persist, by allowing the king to justify that why he has a higher status than the commoners, and therefore allows that system of government to persist. While there's some truth to all of those things, the core problem that cognitive scientists of religion say with all of that kind of work is that it doesn't really get you anywhere. So if you believe in a reductionist approach to science, all of the science eventually is supposed to be at the level of physics, right? You're supposed to be able to, so look at physics, look at astrophysics, for instance. We explain when did the universe start, what the black holes are, what all the stars are, the cosmos, the galaxies. They're working by being able to explain things all the way down to the atoms and subatomic particles, and then down to string theory, according to some people, right? So you're able to take these larger phenomena, explain in simpler and simpler terms. So we should be able to do the same kind of things at the social science level. So we are explaining religion, which is a social phenomena, right? An individual doesn't have religion. That's not called the religion. It's a social thing. A bunch of people have to share those beliefs. So mostly in case of religion, we're talking about shared beliefs, shared rituals, shared institutions. So in order for you to have those shared things, in order for you to explain those things in scientific terms, you then have to explain how those ideas were come into being in the individual's heads, how those ideas are propagated from one individual to another individual, and therefore come to be shared. Uh, if you just keep explaining social things in terms of other social things, you're not going any further lower in that reductionist pyramid, right? You're not going any lower in that reductionist hierarchy. From the social explanations, you need to come down to the individual cognitive explanations, which then we need to explain how individuals have those thoughts in terms of the neural network processes that go on in people's brains, which then we need to explain down to the level of the neurochemical processes that go on, and which again then we can go down to the subatomic level and all of that kind of stuff, right? So that's how real natural science is supposed to work. The problem with all of these kind of theories is that they just keep explaining one social phenomena in terms of another social phenomena. You keep explaining social religion in terms of social hierarchy, in terms of systems of government, in terms of group benefits. You don't really have falsifiable hypotheses. You don't really have a reductionist science, which would give you real explanations. So that, in some sense, is not really scientific explanations. You're not really making any headway in terms of creating this sort of our grand objective of creating this really natural science.
Okay. Like I said, I'll send you the link to that. It's a very short video. I'll send you the link to that afterwards, and you can have a look.
Oh, I would love to hear that. Yeah.
So, like, after you moved to Canada, before you moved to Canada, like you're living in the States now, but before your family moved to Canada, were you still practicing, or had you started having doubts and kind of left? Like, was it more once you came to Canada? Like, I know you wrote a bit about that in your book, but if you can go into that a little bit.
Sure. No, I mean these any kind of belief change. That's another one of those things. So right after 9/11, there was a lot of that. What went wrong? Why do they hate us? What can we do to change their minds? And then the U.S. government, the Western governments, and in particular again the U.S. government spent a lot of money and resources, a lot of blood and treasure in fighting the war of ideas. How can we change their hearts and minds? Radio Al Hurra was started. Canada sponsored a radio in southern Afghanistan during their mission. U.S. sponsored television stations. President Bush appointed a special representative who was supposed to fight the war of ideas, and that in various ways, U.S. government continues in that counter narrative kind of an effort. And the idea is that people are shocked that nothing has happened all of the way up to this point. Actually, people may have become even more anti-US in some sense in some places. I guess what we don't have is we don't seem to understand that this kind of stuff, any kind of belief change, takes a very long time. It's a really arduous and hard process. It's a hard process at an individual level. It takes people years and years and years in order to gravitate from one set of ideas to a different set of ideas. So the kind of thing, the traditional apocryphal example of St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus almost never happened. It's never one place that you can, or one instant in time that you can say, it was that moment, then everything changed for me. At least not for me. That's not been my experience. So I grew up in Rabwa, just like many other Ahmadis, believing in the system, believing in everything that I was told. I believe that God talked to me, and that's again one of the things that Ahmadis say distinguishes from other Muslims. They believe that God talks to all individuals, continues to do so. You should still pray to God for everything they say. Ahmadis say you should, even if you need a shoelace, pray to God and He'll give you a shoelace. So I used to do that, and I grew up in a because my father was a missionary. They don't really give you much money for being a missionary. Actually, the oath that you sign for being a missionary, the request that you send is that I'll never ask you for a penny, and they do pretty much pay you. They hold you to that essentially. So living very in a very sort of poor kind of environment. So there was a lot of things to ask God for. So I talk about in my book how in grade 8 my teacher once said, Afzal, come up, and he said, what, I was walking to my Fajr prayer in the morning and it was dark and I heard a voice and it says Muhammad Afzal scholarship, and you're not only are you going to do well on your exam, you're going to do so well that you're going to get a scholarship, and that is what happened. So there were a lot of things like that. My whole family was pretty fundamentalist. My father was a missionary, so obviously he believed in everything. My maternal grandfather, my mom's father, who lived with us, and who I used to call father as well, and he was even more devoted in some sense than my actual father. So I grew up in that kind of family, but even within that family, I got the reputation of being even more fundamentalist than them in my early teenage years and stuff like that. But eventually, over time, I found that there were contradictions within the system. So the kind of things that they teach you, the values that they teach you, things that are value to them. Egalitarianism is supposed to be a big thing, right? All human beings are equal. It's an important thing in Islam. That I didn't see that to be the case either. That they say that's a goal, yet the rich people within the Muslim Jamaat have more power than poor people. There is the gender thing. Men have a lot more power than women, and yet we keep saying that everybody is supposed to be equal, and we're supposed to be what we have is the best system that anybody else has, right? So how does that work, right? Either we have or we don't, right? And if I believe that is the case, then how do I justify that? So I started asking questions. I guess it's supposed to be part of happens to everybody apparently, according to scholars of religion. We all go through that teenage rebellion kind of a phase. So I guess that was the teenage rebellion thing for me, and that coincided with coming to Canada, and then that also coincided. I had never heard of social sciences in Pakistan. I was taking physics, chemistry, natural sciences, like all other poor boys who are trying to get out of poverty and break the cycle and become engineers, doctors, whatever. So I never even heard of anything like a social science,
that's
right?
Sorry, but that's a very typically Desi thing, right?
Exactly.
You have to become an engineer, doctor, or a lawyer. Like psychologist, all this stuff. That's garbage.
Absolutely, yeah. That's for people who don't want a job. So, but when I came here, then the whole sort of breadth process that North American universities require you to go through, where you have to fulfill your social science requirement, you have to fulfill your language requirements, you have to take a whole bunch of things. You can't just take physics and chemistry and math. So I took them, and wow, this just completely opened my eyes. So I don't know exactly when it was. I don't know what it was that did it. I often think about it, but I still can't pinpoint to any one particular thing. That sort of, but I think if there was anything, it was really that notion that things don't add up. The things that I've believed all my life to be true. Some of the beliefs within that system contradict other beliefs in that system, and there is no way to resolve those contradictions. is what really turned me off.
Yeah. No, but like I agree with what you said there about the whole Saul of Tarsus going to Damascus and then getting a revelation, giving himself to Christ. It was the same kind of thing with Francis Collins, right? Francis Collins,
Yep.
head of the Human Genome Project, hiking through the Adirondacks, sees a waterfall frozen in 3 parts, drops to his knees, and gives himself to Christ right then and there. I mean, it's got to be a progression. I mean, in my case, it was the same thing. With me, it was, my family moved to Canada when I was 6, and then, seeing Carl Sagan for the first time. Like I watched the Cosmos series when it was on TV when it first came out, and seeing that, it sparked, like I was always inquisitive, but that just sparked my curiosity even more. And then it was a progression from 11 to 16, and it was just like, shedding away one belief after another, like, peeling an onion type of thing, right? So yeah, I mean, maybe there are people who it is like for me, Carl Sagan was a catalyst, but maybe there are people who that catalyst hits and then the change comes right away. But, I have to see it more, like I agree with you. I think it's more of a progression. Like it's, it might be something like there might be, maybe Nulli can answer this. Like, if you're a woman and then all of a sudden you realize how horrible, it, the Quran and everything, like, treats women as like half or whatever. And then as soon as you find that out, you're like, well, then no, I don't believe this. I mean, it could be that quick, but I think it's more of a progression.
Oh yeah, I mean, and then the whole Descartes thing, right? Sort of, if you sort of start going layer after layer, and if you want to go down to the core belief that I could, hold against all doubt, what is that core belief? Then everything starts peeling pretty quickly. But for most people, that does not happen instantly. That takes years and years and years. You sort of stew all of these things over a long period of time, and then you go from one side to another. People tell you one explanation, and then you believe it, and then that doesn't make any sense. Then you go through another, and you try to preserve as much belief as possible. And being an artificial intelligence and cognitive scientist, I know that there is a good reason why we want to preserve our beliefs, because we've acquired them through hard work and effort, and we want to preserve as much of it as possible. So we'll come up with all sorts of possible justifications, right? We've all heard of Festinger's prophecy fails. So when a prophecy fails, people don't just give up believing that the doomsday is still about to come. They think it's just coming next week or something, right? Or coming next year. Or maybe we might did something wrong to put off the doomsday. So we want to preserve as much belief as possible, because it takes so much cognitive effort there, and we are constantly seeing evidence for those beliefs, and it's been confirmed over and over and over and over again. And actually, it's funny that you mentioned Sagan, because Sagan, I wanted to be in astrophysics actually when I was a kid growing up in Pakistan, and Sagan's program used to come on Pakistan television late at night, I think around 10 or 11 o'clock, and I used to watch it. I just loved cosmos. I mean, I just couldn't get enough of it. It gave me such a neat, very different kind of explanations about how the universe worked than you heard from from religion, essentially. So
if you look at like the Scandinavian countries, especially I think Iceland, they had they're saying like this is the least religious generation they've had, and the Scandinavian countries have a higher percentage of atheists than North America and stuff. But there was that Pew poll that came out recently, or no, sorry, not Pew poll. Was it Pew or no? It was a Gallup poll that came out from the Middle East, and even in Saudi Arabia, you had like 19% of the people saying they were doubting or they were not religious at all. And I think 5% they said they were openly atheist. If you look at the United States, I think it's roughly about 25%. Do you think there's like an asymptote somewhere where it asymptotes somewhere around the 25% mark? Because like you can look at the Scandinavian countries as maybe an outlier, and it is a small population base. But kind of when you see these results from around the world, it's somewhere between 20 and 25% for each country of people who identify as non-believing. Do you think that like there is an asymptote to that, or do you think that it's just more of a progression and that number will keep growing bigger and bigger, or is it just going to stay flat like at that point?
I mean, scientifically speaking, there are a whole number of interesting questions in this larger question that you asked that just fascinate me, and I don't think they've achieved near the kind of scientific interest that they deserve. And those questions have to do with how we acquire knowledge. In that we don't just the standard scientific theory is that we learn things, the whole scientific method, we form a hypothesis, we observe, we subject it to tests, and therefore we believe those things. That's not how people learn things. Probably 99% of the knowledge for most people, probably for me, is not things that I myself observed or subjected to scientific tests and rigor. And frankly, it wouldn't be a rational thing to do. You would never really get anywhere. You would constantly be subjecting things and never really using that knowledge in any way. It's just too much work that's required to do that. So nobody does it. So how do we actually learn things? How do we come to believe that certain things are true? Schooling, we seem to believe things that other people tell us, people who are in authority. Could be our peers, could be our parents, could be our teachers, could be the books that we read, could be authors, could be all sorts of figures. If 3 of your friends believe something, would you believe it? Where does that exactly lie? What kind of things would they be? Would they be sort of just ordinary things? Something like, that brand of toothpaste is better than another. Would that be changed? Your opinion be changed by 3 of your friends saying versus something as substantial as how the universe started, for instance? Or maybe that may not be substantial for some people, right? But you know what I mean, right? So where does that lie? There's this, how does that work? How many people have to believe it for us to believe it? Who do those people have to be? There's a whole bunch of number of interesting scientific questions. Marketing people would be very interested in finding answers to those questions, and yet we've never really subjected that kind of stuff to that level of scientific scrutiny that I think it deserves. There is this so much good cognitive science that needs to happen there, so much good marketing science that needs to happen there, and we just haven't done it. So without being able to answer all of those questions, and then the role you talked about countries in the Middle East, right? Saudi Arabia, right? Where it's illegal to call yourself, a non-Muslim, where it's illegal to call yourself an atheist. You put your life in jeopardy. It's not even just the government. You're talking about the stuff in Pakistan, right? It's a mob who's gonna run you out of the city. Police might actually protect you, your life. They might hang you later on once the court convicts you, but the mob is going to kill you right away. So if you're living in that kind of situation, then again, there is no room for any other kind of a doubt. It's just not cool to think differently than other people. You blame yourself for having doubts in God, or you blame yourself for having doubts in the Prophet Muhammad or something if you're living in Pakistan. So I mean, there's so many of these things. We don't have answer to any of that. We don't know how people's knowledge acquisition is impacted when they do all of those things. So without being a good scientist, without knowing any of that, I hesitate to answer a question that you asked. I do not know. I don't think we simply have the science to say with any degree of confidence one way or the other about where that threshold lies, what countries are likely to go through, or any of that stuff. So
fair enough. I don't know is a great answer. I mean, I prefer I don't know to someone feeding me a line. But like you were saying, like how do you believe, and how many people does it take to believe? But it leads me back to the line was with from Mill's book on liberty. If all of humanity minus one believes something, then you still have to give credence to what that one person believes. You have to look at it objectively. You can't just say, oh, well, you're only one person, so we can't believe it. Like the thing, well, if only, how many people have to believe for you to believe as well. So like, I like that thing from Mill where, if all of humanity minus one believes something, you still have to give credence to that one. You can't just dismiss that out of hand.
Yeah, but I guess if we can actually answer those questions scientifically. What is the rational thing to do? That is the rational thing to do to to outweigh the 99 or the one? Who should you give more credibility to? You should always give some amount of credibility to the one, but how much should it be? That would depend on a lot more on that who that one person is. What's your relationship with them? If you know them to be truthful, how credible they are, and all of that kind of stuff. So, what is their motive? That plays a big role in people choosing or not choosing to change their mind about something. Does the other person have a motive in telling us what they're telling us? Is this a cigarette company is telling us that cigarettes are great, right? So that kind of stuff.
Okay. Listen, I don't want to take too much more of your time. Thank you very much for talking with us. I mean, if I'd like you to, let people know where they can get your book, because like I said, I found it very interesting. I think other people would too. If you have any, finishing statements, if you want to go over a few things that I might have left out or anything like that. And then, like I said, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The book's available on Amazon, and if you want to read the book for free in soft copy, you can do that. You don't want to buy a hard copy from Amazon. It's available on the publisher's website, which is degroiter.com. And if you're likely to forget that, then I'll give you a really easy one. Just type moderatefundamentalists.com or just type afzalupal.com, and you'll get a link to the soft copy of the book and a hard copy that you can buy from Amazon as well. And thank you so much.
You're not supposed to tell people where they can get it for free. You're supposed to tell people where they have to buy it.
My objective is not to sell books. I didn't write it to make any money. I'm not likely to receive a single penny from the book. My objective is just to be able to put these scientific ideas out there in the public domain, and I think I've done my job. So and thank you for your interest and for reading the book and for having me here. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. And do you want to, if it's up to you, if you want to give out your socials, if people want to reach out to you on Twitter or anything like that. If not, we can.
Certainly, yeah. So I'm on Twitter. I'm at afzalupal.com, AFZALUPAL. So at Afzal Upal on Twitter, and then you can look me up on Facebook as well at Afzal Upal. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I enjoyed this conversation so much. I might want to have you back on so you can talk some more about this, because like I said, I'm a bit of a geek, so I found this very, very interesting. And to everyone listening, thank you guys very much for listening. And if you liked the video, please give it a like, subscribe, hit the little bell to get notifications, and we will see you guys or talk to you guys again soon. Have a good night, everyone. And I'm going to say goodbye for Nulli because she's got a really sore throat. That's why she's been quiet today. So she kind of joined us and soldiered along a little bit. And hopefully she feels better soon. And have a good night, everyone. Thanks.
Good night.